İstasyon başlıyor.
Hazırlayıp sunan Mesut Şenol.
This is BAU Radio Station program, and you are with us. And I have a guest here from this university's academic personnel, and Dr. Oliver Wright from the Psychology Department and Faculty of Economics and Administrative and Social Sciences. Welcome to our program.
Thanks for inviting me to be on it.
So this is an interesting broadcast for us because we're conducting it in English. So how do you feel about it, being an academic person and being a guest on the radio program?
I've never been on a radio show before, so it's a first for me. An interesting experience, I think.
Okay, and the subjects we're gonna talk about are definitely interesting ones, and you are specialized in some areas of psychology, but let's first start with the psychology's main concern. What is psychology, and is it a science?
I think that it depends. A lot of people, when they try and understand or when they think about psychology, they don't really think of it as a scientific subject. But certainly in academia, it's very much a science.
And although it is in academic circles considered as a concern of science, still it has to do a lot of elements of personal lives of ourselves, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's certainly true. A lot of people are interested in psychology. If you go into any bookshop, you'll see there's always quite a large section which has psychology-related books in it. It's also something very personal for us because we are really no more than the sum of our minds.
And so how does psychology deal with our minds and souls in its own way? Is it also a scientifically researched area?
Well, the soul, I don't think is really a topic for scientific inquiry because there's no way of investigating it. Some areas, some things are just closed to science. You can never get hold of them using scientific methods. The mind is almost something a bit like that as well, because the mind is something that you can never see directly, you can never measure it directly. So if you think about other sciences like, for example, biology or geology, there's always something there that you can directly measure and investigate. The mind, though, is ethereal. It's not something which we can get a ruler out and see how big it is. We always have to investigate the mind by investigating other things like human behaviour or human brain process. So it's a slightly strange topic for scientific investigation and a difficult topic because of that reason, that you can't directly measure it or access it.
So the psychologists kind of deal with these psychological issues indirectly to measure them and to maybe, if necessary, to treat them if it is a psychological disorder or something like that. So what is the relationship between psychological anomalies, problems, and a smooth running mind?
Well, it's slightly difficult to answer that because most psychologists are not interested in mental disorders and mental illnesses. One of the main focuses is just trying to understand how a normal mind works, and that's something where there are huge gaps in our understanding. There are lots of very basic areas where psychologists don't really know anything about how the mind does these tricks. A good example is consciousness.
Yeah.
Consciousness is something which has proved incredibly difficult for psychologists, scientists to study, even though it's something which seems so central to our lives. It's a very personal thing.
Yeah, what is human consciousness in a sense? Maybe it is tied to culture, to other things that we are exposed to in life. One of them should be language, right? We think, we use our mind, our imagination with the language, with the words. So we will be dealing on this special parts of psychology, the relationship between mind and language. So I think this is your main interest in psychology study of yours, right?
Yeah, it's an area I do or have previously done quite a lot of research in. So my PhD thesis was really focusing on the relationship between, I think we can say, thought and language. And it's an issue which psychologists have been interested in for decades, really. I think the easiest way of explaining it or framing what the research is all about is to say that psychologists, they want to know how language affects thought. And there are two kind of extreme or opposed views about that. And one of those views is that what we're doing with language is just turning our thoughts into words. So the idea here is that we have almost another secret language, which we can call the language of thought. And that's how our minds work. But then when we need to communicate with other people, we have to turn those thoughts into words, and those words are whatever language you happen to speak.
So does it matter which language you're using in your communication? Does it affect the thought is being created?
Well, if thought comes before language, then language is just turning thoughts into words. So the particular language that you speak isn't really very important. I think there's a basic principle in translation, which is that anything from one language can be translated into another language, any other language, and that goes very much with this idea that what you're doing with language is turning thoughts into words.
Say that in old days or in socially, culturally a little bit lower level societies, in tribal societies, for example, in Africa, compared to so-called more advanced, culturally advanced societies. Mm-hmm. So the language, how much effect of the language and vocabulary capability of the language has an impact on the more sophisticated, advanced way of thinking, thoughts?
I would say probably not much, because if it's the case, as I said earlier, that you're just turning your thoughts into words when you speak, then everyone, regardless of the language they live, whether the particular language they speak, is going to be kind of inhabiting the same mental world, and all they're doing is turning what's happening in that mental world into words when they speak.
So it means that your vocabulary of your language lexicon might be limited, but still the process is almost the same, right?
Yeah, that's one view. I mean, there is another view which is almost the opposite of what I've said. So what I've been saying so far is this idea that, or the view I've been defending so far is the view that language is almost not very important in terms of psychology. It's just a way of turning thoughts into words. The other way of thinking about it is almost the opposite. It's to say that what you're doing, what a little child is doing when they're, for example, learning to speak, is at the same time they're learning to think. So that's another way of thinking about the relationship between language and thought, which would say that thought or language is fundamental for thought, and that without a language we would actually not really be able to think in a way that's similar to the way that we can think because of language.
Great, and we will continue talking to Dr. Oliver Wright. Yeah, we are with us on station program, and we are hosting Dr. Oliver Wright, and we were talking about some examples of the relationship between language and mind. And now I'd like to ask him, can you talk about the child development in terms of his or her language acquisition and kind of mind faculties development?
Yeah, there's a lot that could be said about that. Children's minds are obviously very different from adult minds. It doesn't take much interaction with a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child to notice these differences. So one thing developmental psychologists try and do is they try and explain what it is that changes in a child's mind that allows the child's mind to change into something like an adult's mind. I think everyone agrees that biology is an incredibly important factor, because there are obviously various genetic schemes unfolding that will affect the development of the brain, and that in turn will affect the development of the mind. But specifically in terms of language, there's a couple of different theories about how language can affect the development of, let's say, cognitive processes, mental processes in children. One of them is by a famous psychologist called Piaget.
Yeah.
He was a Frenchman. He had an idea about development, which is if you give a child the right kind of environment, they'll organise their own mental development. They don't need very much help. So you just need to give them things like, toys, props, the necessary equipment. They'll do it all themselves.
That will help not only their motor development but also cognitive ones.
Cognitive development. And that really goes with the idea that I think the idea that thought comes before language, and learning to speak is just learning to put your thoughts in words. So that's Piaget's view. An alternative view to that is by another developmental psychologist. He was a Russian called Vygotsky, who lived in the early years of the last century. And what he thought was that social development is absolutely critical for cognitive or mental development, and obviously language is a key factor in socialization. So what Vygotsky said was that when a child is learning to speak, they're not just learning to put their thoughts into words. What they're actually doing is learning to structure and organise their thoughts. And so learning a language very much structures the way you think. So that's a kind of opposite.
So language kind of gives you the frame and the mechanism that your thoughts are going to be organized.
Yeah, that's exactly the way Vygotsky described it, actually. He used the idea of scaffolding. So if you think about building a house or something, quite often you would put scaffolding up around the skeleton of the house, and then you need to stand on the scaffolding to build the house. And Vygotsky's idea is that language serves a function, something like that. It provides the kind of scaffolding and structure that then allows you to build the kind of house of mental abilities, let's say.
So in this respect, I guess this mind in child and later on in adulthood is very much being affected by many factors. One is obviously here, as you stated, the language. Mm-hmm. Probably there are other elements or stimuli that would have an impact on the developing mind. So you're saying that this is a world, that mind is or should be, the psychology is subject to be worth studying. Also, I guess the behavior out of thoughts is also something to be connected, to be associated. How do you think all these studies on mind help us explain behavior?
Well, I think the basic, probably the most basic aim of psychology as a science is to try and explain behaviour, because, as I said earlier, the mind is something intangible.
Yeah.
It's almost like a theoretical construct.
Whereas behavior is all scientifically readily measured thing,
yeah,
right?
And the reason for this scientific interest in something called the mind is because it seems like a really good way of explaining behaviour. If you just think about our normal interactions with other people, when we try and understand what they're doing, we usually frame those explanations by using mental ideas.
Just could you give me and to our listeners an idea, what is behavior? Is behavior something always tangible? Some body language, some gestures could be also considered behavior?
Yeah, any kind of movement you make is a behaviour. So absolutely anything that when you see another person, if you notice any movement, that's a behaviour. One other kind of behaviour which you might not think of as behaviour is speech. Speech is a kind of behaviour because it requires making movements to produce a series of sounds, which are speech sounds.
I guess any speech could also contain many other features, like carrying the track of your feelings or emotions, right?
Yeah, certainly. It's a thing that's very natural for humans to do, is to look at other people's behaviour, including their speech, and then try and understand what's happening in their mind as a result by using that behaviour.
Right, interesting. Yes, we are with Dr. Oliver Wright, and we continue our talk about mind, behavior, psychology, and now I'd like to ask him why it is difficult, can you a little bit dwell on it, to measure the mind and the connection between mind and behavior?
Well, it's difficult to measure the mind just because of the way it's defined. The mind is something, as I said earlier, which is intangible. So if you want to try and understand what's happening in someone's mind, there's no way of directly seeing. We can never enter another person's head. We can never enter another person's thoughts. All we can do is try and get some idea of what they're thinking about or how they think by measuring things that can be measured. And those things that can be measured can include things like behaviour, because we believe that the mind is something which produces or causes behaviour. You can also measure things like the brain, try and understand the mind by measuring the brain. So the brain is something which is physical. You can take it out of someone's head, you can weigh it, you can press it, you can see how it works. And the mind is something which appears to be created by the brain. So another way of trying to understand the mind is to understand the physical machine, which is the brain, that creates the mind.
So it is somewhat a physical element in it, and also other things that is difficult to measure, but psychology is working on it extensively. So way of overcoming all these difficulties are probably lately developed scientific methods. They should be providing you some insight into these processes in mind and in behavior. Mm-hmm. So could you talk about a little bit of these new techniques to overcome these difficulties?
Well, I think that the biggest advance in the last 30 years or so by far has been the invention of brain imaging techniques. So there are now things like fMRI and EEG, which can measure activity in the brain as it happens. And by understanding what changes in the brain that happen over time, and even quite short periods of time, then we can try and use that information to then gain some insight into various mental processes.
So that gives us kind of concrete connection, right?
No, it's not a concrete connection in the same way that behavior is not a concrete connection. Because when you measure something in the brain, you're measuring something physical, you're measuring the brain.
Something, electricity circuits on or not, even that doesn't give you exact picture, right?
Because the brain and the mind are not the same thing. The brain, like I said, is a kind of physical organ, and the belief is that the brain gives rise to the mind. But if you go and look in the brain in a lot of detail, you can't find directly a mental process. You can find the neurons or the brain circuits that are probably involved in that specific mental process.
I see. Now we will continue our talk on your expertise area. This is more linguistic relativity hypothesis, whether language puts thought into words or vice versa. The language fundamentally shapes our thought. This is interesting, very, very interesting subject. Yes, you are with us on BAU Radio on station program, and Dr. Oliver Wright with us, and we're talking about all this psychological subject that he's an expert and teaching here at BAU University. So my last words were about this, your thesis and your expertise area on linguistics relativity hypothesis. And can you explain us how you were involved in this subject, and can you tell us the fundamentals of this hypothesis?
Yeah, let me start with the basic idea. So if you look at different languages and compare them, there are some quite large differences between languages. I don't just mean differences in the words they use, like, for example, in Turkish you would say kedi and in English you would say cat. There are some slightly more profound or important differences between languages than that, to do with things like their grammatical structure, and also the categories they use. So maybe if I give a couple of examples of differences between languages, that would help. So Turkish is an example of a language that uses something called an evidential marker. And an evidential marker is something which shows how certain a speaker is about the information they're giving. So I'll give an example in Turkish. You could say in Turkish, Ankara'ya gitti or Ankara'ya gitmiş. And that has a slightly different meaning. When you say Ankara'ya gitmiş, it implies that you didn't actually see that person going to Ankara.
So maybe it was reported to you. You heard about it.
So it's less. The evidence is less sure. It's kind of second-hand evidence. So Turkish makes that kind of distinction between things that you've seen yourself, things that you've heard about, and it puts that distinction in a verb, in the end of the verb. In English, you don't have the ability to do that when you use a verb. You can give evidential information in English, but that requires another kind of structure, which would be something like saying, I heard he went to Ankara allegedly. But that information about the certainty is not included in the verb. So that's one example of a difference. People who study linguistic relativity are they want to know if those kind of differences in the structure of language and the way they encode meaning, does that have effects on how we think about the world or how we interact with the world?
Yeah, it's kind of, I wonder why or how it makes a difference in terms of meanings and thought.
Well, people used to think there were very large differences. So probably in, I think, about the 1950s, people thought that language was essentially a kind of arbitrary or almost random way of cutting up the world, and that those differences between the way languages kind of cut up and organise the world have huge differences on the way we think. But these days, the consensus has changed to something slightly different, which is that language can have some effects on kind of thought processes, but those effects seem to be quite limited. So most of the evidence that comes out these days suggests that language isn't really doing very much. It might be doing a few small things to thought, but differences in language don't seem to have these big effects on
a total effect on
thought, which were originally predicted and expected.
So what other things that have an effect as well as this language situation?
An effect on
the thoughts?
Well, I think the main thing that affects our thought is our experiences. We each have unique experiences over the course of our lives, and those experiences are obviously going to be one important factor that creates the differences that we find between individual people in the way they think, the way their psychology works.
Maybe socialization and the values and prejudices people hold might have an impact on the thoughts.
Well, they almost certainly do, but they all come from experiences that we've had in the world.
Yeah, so there is a kind of culturalization and personalization of all this impact in the society, right?
Oh yeah, very large effect, I would say. The decisions we make, the attitudes we form, the opinions we have, the beliefs we have, they, I think, largely come to us from the society that we're in.
So in that respect, psychology is a field that should be considered and studied in line or in cooperation with other related or neighboring science fields, right? So it's like sociology and other
very much so.
Disciplines.
And, there's one branch of psychology, it's social psychology, which specifically examines how our interactions with other people and how other people can affect the way our minds work.
How about there are other sub-sections of psychology, political psychology, cultural psychology, and even I guess there is a field called philosophy of psychology. Mm-hmm. So what would you like to say about these differentiations? Psychology
is a really massive field, and in some ways it's unfortunate that all of these different areas come under the same heading, which is psychology. When I was a postgraduate student, one of the professors said in one of the classes, that psychologists should just have a kind of a fight over the name psychology, and whoever wins the fight can call themselves psychologists, and the other groups should go and invent a different name for themselves, because it's such a huge and diverse field that there might not actually be very much relationship between some different areas of psychology.
Right. And could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between culture's features, and the psychology? How culture or psychology of the person are intertwined?
Yeah, this is really related to the idea of cross-cultural psychology, which is a branch of psychology that investigates how differences between groups of people or societies can affect the mind. And obviously one of those differences we touched on a little bit earlier is the idea of different groups that speak different languages. But I think different cultures also have very different customs and kind of normal behaviours. So in cross-cultural psychology, what you might try and do is investigate how those different customs or behaviours can affect mental processes, and also, I guess to some extent, trying to explain where these differences between societies and cultures come from.
You're listening to a program called Station, and now we are at the last leg of the program with Dr. Oliver Wright. We're talking about psychology and how the connection between mind and language. These are all the interesting subjects. But now I'd like to ask him the question of how education affects the mind. I think many people are curious about it, because if we educate our children, we think they are getting better thinking people. Is that so?
Well, you have to define first what makes better thinking and worse thinking. It might change the way you think. Because education, of course, is a kind of experience, and as I said earlier, all kinds of experience have some effect on the mind and mental processes. So I think if you're interested in how large the effect of education is on our psychology, the answer really depends where you're coming from. If you think about something like comparing a chimpanzee, or if you think about the basic mental processes, things like our memory, how we perceive the world, those kind of mental processes, education is not going to have very much effect on basic mental processes. But there are other things, other facets of our psychology that education can have an effect on.
What kind of effects, for example?
Well, I think one of the most important, or probably the single most important thing we get from education is literacy, because literacy gives us this ability to access and use information that's not immediately there in front of us. We can read a book. We can also communicate in different ways if we're literate. So that, I think, has a very important effect on the way we interact and behave in the world. Also, I would imagine that being able to read and write, and also numeracy, they help you structure your thoughts in ways that you wouldn't be able to do if you weren't literate and if you weren't numerate. And that gives certain benefits. So even if you think about basic mathematical ability, just being able to do addition, subtraction, they're very useful mental skills to have, and we get them from education.
And they are very useful in your life, right?
Oh, I think, yeah, certainly. Throughout our lives, it's if you're an illiterate person in a literate society, life is quite difficult. Everything is confusing. Things like signs, newspapers, they're inaccessible to you. So the information that you can take in from the world is much more limited, and that will have an effect on things like the decisions.
And your interpretation is not quite satisfactory then, right?
Well, again, I don't want to say that some people have more satisfactory interpretations, other people have less satisfactory interpretations. But if you have the ability to, or if you want to make good decisions and choices in life, I think it's quite useful to be able to, first of all, get access to a lot of information. And then
to be informed and to make more educated decisions.
Well, yeah, to make decisions that are going to be better for you. And, being literate, I think, helps you to do that to a large extent.
And how about the children when they grow, if they are educated well, and how does this affect their mental and factual abilities for later life?
Well, if you think about education, it gives specific kinds of skills. If you think about university education, students go to university and they specialise in a particular area and get specific skills. And that probably has some direct effect on the way they think about the world. But I think more important are the indirect effects. So if you have a good education, by and large, in general, you'll get a better job. And that will improve the amount of money you have and the amount of, it will improve your living conditions as well.
Also, professionally speaking, if a person does get all the necessary education and training, or his or her profession, say a physician, a doctor, without education, I guess he or she would have not been able to perform the job properly, right? In this world.
Yeah, people generally, not always, but generally they get jobs based on their competence. And that competence comes from education.
Right. Now we come almost to the end of the program. So what would you like to say about your residency and tenure here at the university? How did this experience for your perception of Turkey and science life